January 1945, somewhere along a frozen tree line in Western Europe. The ground is iron hard, locked by winter. Snow has been crushed into grey paste by boots and shell fragments. The air smells of burnt powder and wet wool. A Browning machine gun sits low in the dirt, its metal darkened, its barrel already scarred from hours of fire. Steam rises from it in short, angry breaths. The man behind it has not slept. 48 hours blur into one long night. His fingers are numb, his ears ringing, his throat raw from shouting warnings no one needs anymore. He no longer counts minutes. He counts belts, he counts movements in the trees, he counts bodies only when the firing stops. German infantry keeps coming, small groups at first, then larger ones probing, testing, dying. Somewhere higher command once said this position could not be held. The map showed it clearly. Too exposed, too thin, too many approaches. The numbers did not work. But maps do not show what happens when a weapon is pushed beyond its design, or when a single position becomes the hinge of an entire front. And this frozen clearing did not exist by accident. It was the product of a war already stretched to its limits. By January 1945, the war in Western Europe had entered its most punishing phase. Germany was no longer advancing on grand maps, but it was far from defeated. The Ardennes counteroffensive had torn open the Allied front only weeks earlier, forcing American units into desperate defensive battles across forests, villages, and frozen ridgelines. Even after the German offensive began to collapse, the fighting did not ease. In many sectors, it intensified. American infantry divisions were stretched thin. Replacements arrived with minimal training. Supply lines worked, but just barely. Ammunition, food, and winter clothing often arrived late or not at all. Units were ordered to hold ground that doctrine would normally abandon. Commanders understood the stakes. If German forces broke through even briefly, roads, bridges, and artillery positions could be lost, slowing the entire Allied advance toward the Rhine. The German army, though battered, was still dangerous. Volksgrenadier divisions, newly formed units combining veteran cadres with young conscripts and older men, were designed specifically for defensive and counterattacking roles. They relied heavily on small unit tactics, infiltration and close-range assaults. Mortars, machine pistols, and aggressive movement were used to overwhelm isolated American positions before heavier Allied firepower could respond. Winter favored these methods. Snow muffled movement, fog hid approach routes, trees and hedgerows broke visibility into short, deadly lanes. Battles were often decided not by tanks or aircraft, but by which side could dominate 100 meters of ground with rifles and machine guns. At the center of American defensive doctrine stood the machine gun. The Browning M1919 was not new in 1945. Its design traced back to the First World War, refined across decades of service. By the time American forces crossed into Germany's borders, the M1919A4 and A6 variants were standard issue, air-cooled, belt-fed, firing the .30-06 cartridge. It was reliable, accurate, and brutally effective when employed correctly. But it was not invincible. The M1919 lacked the quick, change barrel of German machine guns like the MG34 or MG42. Sustained fire risked overheating, barrels warped, headspace shifted, crews were trained to fire in controlled bursts, rotating barrels only when absolutely necessary. Doctrine assumed 2 or 3 man teams, a gunner, an assistant, and an ammunition bearer. Reality rarely allowed for doctrine. During defensive actions in early 1945, American machine gunners often found themselves isolated. Casualties reduced crews, communications broke down. Positions that were meant to support one another became islands under pressure. In these moments, the M1919 became both a lifeline and a liability. It could stop an assault, but only if it kept firing. Field modifications were common. Gunners adjusted feed trays, improvised cooling methods, altered tripods, and modified firing routines. Official manuals did not encourage this, but frontline survival did. A gun that fired too fast would burn out. A gun that fired too slow would be overrun. German commanders understood this balance. Assault groups were trained to draw fire, force overheating, then rush the position when the gun fell silent. Mortar rounds would bracket the emplacement. Riflemen would probe flanks. Submachine gunners would close in under cover of noise and confusion. The terrain made withdrawal nearly impossible. Frozen ground resisted digging. Snow exposed movement. Roads were watched by German artillery observers. Holding a position often meant enduring wave after wave until either relief arrived or nothing did. Somewhere along the American line, one such position existed at a critical junction. It guarded a narrow approach through broken woods and open ground. Lose it, and German infantry could slip behind the main line, threatening supply routes and artillery units further back. Hold it, and the front remained intact. Higher command had little faith in its survivability. The numbers did not favor the defenders. German forces in the area were aggressive and familiar with the ground. The weather grounded aircraft and limited artillery effectiveness. The unit assigned to the sector was under strength, and yet, the position was ordered held. Within that order sat a single machine gun emplacement, manned by one exhausted American soldier and a Browning M1919 that would soon be pushed far beyond its intended limits. What followed would not be recorded as a major battle. It would not earn a campaign ribbon. It would be reduced to lines in after-action reports and whispered stories among veterans. But the pressure building in those woods, hour by hour, was real, and it was about to test both man and machine to their breaking point. The first reality of the position was human, not tactical. The man behind the gun was already worn down before the fighting reached its peak. Sleep came in fragments measured in minutes, not hours. Cold seeped through layers of clothing until it felt permanent, as if it had settled into bone. Hunger dulled into something quieter and more dangerous. Fear did not announce itself loudly. It arrived as focus sharpened, as time slowed during each approach through the trees. Every movement became personal. Every shadow demanded attention. There was no room for heroism in the moment, only the discipline to stay still, to wait and to fire only when the target committed. Survival depended on emotional control as much as physical endurance. Tactically, the gun was placed where the ground itself did the work. A shallow rise gave a clear lane of fire across a natural approach route. Fallen trees and shell craters funneled movement toward the muzzle. The position was not ideal, but it was deliberate. The gun did not sweep wildly. It cut narrow arcs, denying the enemy freedom to maneuver. Bursts were timed to break momentum, not to chase targets. When the firing stopped, it was intentional. Silence became a weapon, drawing German infantry forward again, convincing them the gun had finally overheated or the crew had been killed. Each renewed assault paid for that assumption. Mechanically, the M1919 was being pushed past doctrine. The gunner shortened bursts further than training suggested, allowing the barrel to cool just enough between engagements. When overheating became unavoidable, firing pauses were calculated, not reactive. Snow was packed around the barrel jacket, melting instantly but buying seconds. Headspace and timing were checked by feel rather than tools. Belts were staged in advance, links carefully aligned to avoid jams. Every malfunction was treated as a life-threatening emergency because it was. The weapon remained functional not because it was designed to endure this, but because it was understood intimately. Leadership, in this moment, existed without proximity. Orders had already been given. Hold the ground. Delay at all costs. There were no officers nearby issuing encouragement or corrections. Responsibility collapsed inward. Decisions that would normally require command approval were made alone and instantly. When to fire, when to conserve, when to risk overheating, when to expose oneself to reposition the gun by inches that could mean the difference between enfilade and blind spot. This absence of direct leadership did not weaken the defense. It clarified it. The mission became brutally simple. From the German side, the assaults followed recognizable patterns. Reconnaissance by fire. Small groups advancing under cover of trees. Mortar rounds testing range. Then the rush. German infantry expected the American gun to falter. They were trained to exploit hesitation. But each attempt met disciplined fire that arrived at precisely the wrong moment. Momentum collapsed again and again. Bodies accumulated not in dramatic piles, but scattered along approach routes, marking each failed calculation. The Germans adapted, but so did the gunner. And as night blurred into day and back again, the pressure built toward a moment when either the weapon would fail or the assaults would finally break. That moment came not with a sudden explosion, but with a narrowing of options that forced both sides toward a final decision. The decisive phase began in the early hours of the second night. Visibility was near zero. A low fog settled between the trees, flattening distance and distorting sound. What could be heard came in fragments, boots slipping on frozen ground, shouted instructions cut short, the hollow thump of mortars firing deeper in the woods. The machine gun barrel was already heat-scarred, its surface discolored from repeated cycles of fire and cooling. Ammunition belts lay coiled beside the position, stiff with cold, their brass dulled. At approximately WW2 hours, the pattern changed. German mortar fire no longer probed, it settled. Rounds walked closer with deliberate spacing, forcing the gunner to press low into the earth. Shrapnel snapped through branches overhead. Dirt and snow collapsed into the position, filling sleeves, freezing instantly against skin. The M1919 was shielded as best it could be, but fragments struck the tripod and receiver, ringing metal like a bell. Then came movement. Not one group. Several. From different angles. Not a rush, but a steady advance timed between mortar bursts. This was no longer a test. It was an attempt to take the position intact. The gunner waited until shapes separated from fog into certainty. When he fired, the burst was short and precise. One figure dropped, then another. The gun fell silent again. German infantry pressed forward, convinced the gun had finally overheated or jammed. They were close now, close enough that voices carried clearly, strained and urgent. The next burst was longer. Too long. The barrel temperature spiked dangerously. The gunner felt it through the receiver. He stopped firing not because the threat had ended, but because the weapon demanded it. Steam rolled off the barrel jacket, rising into the fog like smoke from a signal fire. The pause nearly ended everything. A German assault group broke from cover, sprinting the final distance. Rifles came up. A grenade landed short, skidding across frozen ground. The gunner forced the M1919 back into action despite the risk. The recoil was uneven now. The sound changed. He fired anyway. The assault collapsed 10 meters from the position. By dawn, German casualties lay scattered across the approach routes in numbers that no longer suggested probing attacks. Some had fallen while advancing, others while trying to withdraw. A few lay where they had paused, likely waiting for orders that never came. When firing ceased entirely for the first time in hours, the silence was absolute. Shortly after first light, American riflemen from a neighboring sector made contact. They moved cautiously, expecting resistance. Instead, they found a position still held, a machine gun still operational, and a gunner who had lost track of time entirely. German dead were counted not with triumph but with disbelief. Estimates would vary later, but the number stabilized around 90, 5 over 40, 8 hours. The figure was not celebrated. It was recorded, quietly, as part of understanding what had happened. The position had held. The breakthrough had not come. And with daylight, the weight of what had occurred began to settle in. That weight would follow the unit forward, long after the frozen ground was left behind. Daylight revealed what darkness had concealed, and it did so without mercy. The ground in front of the position was torn apart. Snow was stained and trampled into mud despite the cold. Weapons lay where they had been dropped, rifles, ammunition pouches, helmets partially filled with frozen water. German casualties were spread unevenly, marking the flow of each failed approach. Medics moved through the area slowly, not to treat, but to confirm. There were no wounded among those who had fallen closest to the gun. American losses in the immediate sector were comparatively light, but the cost was visible in exhaustion. Men moved carefully, as if sudden motion might break something inside them. The machine gunner was examined by a medic who noted frostbite beginning in the fingers and face, dehydration, and extreme fatigue. He was ordered to the rear only after the position was fully reinforced. Reports began moving upward through command channels. Company-level summaries noted that an enemy penetration attempt had failed. Battalion after-action reports highlighted an unusually high number of German casualties concentrated along a single axis of advance. The machine gun position was identified as the decisive factor. No language of heroics was used. The tone was analytical, focused on outcomes and lessons. German records, fragmentary and incomplete, would later support the conclusion. Units in the sector reported severe losses during nighttime counterattacks, citing unexpectedly sustained automatic fire from American positions believed to be lightly held. Commanders noted the failure of standard infiltration tactics and the inability to silence key defensive weapons under adverse weather conditions. Strategically, the impact was limited but meaningful. The held position denied German forces access to a road network used by American artillery and supply units. A temporary German foothold, had it been achieved, could have forced a localized withdrawal and delayed planned operations. Instead, the line stabilized. Within days, American forces resumed their advance, pushing German units further back toward prepared defensive lines deeper inside Germany. The machine gun itself was inspected. The barrel showed signs of warping. The receiver bore small fragment impacts. It was removed from service shortly afterward, replaced without ceremony. There was no attempt to preserve it as an artifact. In a war defined by scale, individual tools were expendable. The gunner's name appeared briefly in recommendations for recognition. What level of acknowledgement followed varied by unit and command climate. Some actions were rewarded formally. Others were absorbed into the collective effort without distinction. What mattered operationally was clear: the position had been held when doctrine suggested it should not have been. Among those who had arrived later to relieve the sector, the story spread quietly, not exaggerated, not dramatized, simply stated: 1 gun, 1 man, 48 hours. The numbers were repeated not as boast, but as explanation for why the ground in front of the position looked the way it did. As the front moved eastward and winter slowly loosened its grip, the frozen clearing faded into memory. The war did not pause to acknowledge what had happened there. It simply moved on. But for those who understood how close the line had come to breaking, the meaning of those hours lingered, waiting to be understood in a broader sense. War rarely announces its most important moments. They do not always arrive with flags raised or lines redrawn on maps. More often they pass quietly, recorded in ledgers and reports, their significance measured only later, if at all. The stand made over those 48 hours did not change the direction of the war. It did not alter grand strategy. But it revealed something essential about how modern warfare actually functions when systems strain and doctrine dissolves under pressure. The Browning M1919 was never meant to carry such a burden alone. It was designed to be part of a network, supported, rotated, resupplied. Yet in that frozen clearing, it became the network. Its limitations were understood and managed not through manuals, but through instinct shaped by experience. The weapon did not win the fight by rate of fire or technical superiority. It endured because it was used with restraint, discipline, and an intimate understanding of its own breaking point. The man behind it mattered just as much, not as a symbol, but as a reminder that war is ultimately reduced to individuals making irreversible decisions under conditions no training can fully replicate. There was no room for ideology in those hours, no speeches, only the narrowing of focus that comes when survival and responsibility converge. The kill count, later repeated and recorded, was not the point. It was a consequence. German infantry that advanced through that ground were not faceless figures. They were soldiers operating under orders, applying doctrine that had worked elsewhere. Their failure was not due to cowardice or incompetence, but to the reality that even well-planned tactics can collapse when met by unexpected resistance sustained longer than anticipated. Stories like this rarely survive intact. They are too small for history books and too large for personal memory. They exist in fragments, after action reports, medical notes, brief mentions in regimental histories. Over time, the details blur. Numbers are questioned. Names fade. What remains is the understanding that wars are not decided solely by mass or momentum, but by moments when collapse is postponed just long enough to matter. In the end, the frozen ground thawed. The front moved forward. The weapon was replaced. The man went on, carrying an experience few would ever fully understand. The impossible had not been overturned by miracles or myth, but by endurance, measured one controlled burst at a time. And in that truth, the quiet weight of history rests.